Our speaker today is Lisa Huff. Lisa works for a user behavior analysis company where she focuses on consulting with organizations to understand their ongoing security challenges with existing solutions, as well as discuss ways of providing more visibility into user behavior within organizations and how this adds much needed visibility to analyst and SOC teams. Lisa has been in the networking and security space for close to 20 years. She started when she was 3 and has worked with some of the largest organizations to help them better understand their ongoing challenges they face with staying ahead of their threats to their organization. And this presentation is UBA Awakens, How Data Science is Replacing Signatures and Rules. Lisa, it's all yours.
That was a mouthful. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Huff. Just to give you a little bit of a background for me, I started off just doing traditional consulting. You know, the firewall IDS has got every certification known to man. And then I moved into the vendor world, and I was working for one of the larger SIM vendors that were out there and sold a lot of that stuff. And UBA is something that is really interesting to me because during those days when I was working for that SIM vendor, it was a challenge for us to track user activity through the use of static rules. So moving into UBA, using data science to do that type of tracking of user activity, giving visibility, is a lot easier to do than the traditional static rules that you would have to do with a traditional SIM. But just giving you guys a little bit of a background, I came from the SIM world. I hopped over to an organization that was focusing on full packet capture solutions. And then I was working with a company that was focusing on threat intelligence. And then I pivoted over into the UVA market. And again, at the end of the day, from my perspective, and the reason why I moved to the UVA space was breaches are happening. The bad guys are making their way in. And at the end of the day, what they're looking for are credentials. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Please interrupt me if you have any questions as we're going through this process. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about security monitoring through logs. And traditionally that's done through some type of log repository or SIM solution. We're going to talk about some familiar incidents that everyone's aware of, how detection is changing, applying machine learning through some of the principles that UBA provides versus what you would traditionally do through a log management solution, and then talking about user behavior analytics to end the presentation. So today's security monitoring best practices, again, this is very familiar with everyone. You know, visibility is always a problem. You want to be able to see potentially harmful things happening within the environment. Customers are making a lot of investments in solutions that are looking for detection and monitoring. So deploying products that will detect that type of activity. And of course, the big investment that most customers make is being able to log all of that data. Customers may have made massive investments over the last 5 to 10 years in log repositories or SIMs, whether it's ArcSight, whether it's Splunk or Q1 Radar. Customers have made massive investments in log management solutions. And they're logging every good and bad event. In many cases, that's because of compliance, and in some cases, because that's just basically the place that they want to do the dump the logs. Because there's a people problem, right? I mean, there's not enough people to look through those logs to really truly understand what's happening within an environment. And for people to try to keep up with identifying new risks, you have to pretty much be spending a lot of time developing new rules. And again, trying to maintain a forefront in front of all of these bad guys through static rules and through correlation is very difficult. So, a few requirements. In many cases, the basic requirements for customers are trying to figure out how do I get visibility into lateral movement? How do I track remote employees? How do I track my business partners, my supply chain? You know, the issue with Target was because of one of their supply chain vendors, a very small supply chain vendor where the credentials were compromised. How do I deal with data exfiltration and malicious activity and malware? In many cases, the solutions that they're making investments in are trying to focus on these types of requirements. And in many cases, a majority of these logs are getting dumped into the SIM. So this is a traditional analyst workflow. mounds and mounds of logs, attempting to build correlation rules that are going to make sense of some of these logs. And in many cases, they're focusing on those things that they know about. But in many cases, they're missing out on the unknown, the zero-day attacks. And once something happens, even if they have correlation in place, when incident response happens, they typically have to go back to the original log source anyway to perform their investigations, to grep through the logs, to query through the logs. But this is traditionally what the analysts are having to deal with today. Again, Target, I mentioned that earlier today. Everyone's aware of it. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But again, it was a situation whereby they had investments in very good solutions. They had purchased FireEye. I mean, they had a lot of solutions in place today, but they missed it. They missed it because of the noise. I mean, all of these logs are going into their SIM, but it still happened. And they have a SOC. Target has actually invested in a SOC, but they missed this because of the noise with having to look at a SIM on a daily basis. Same thing with Neiman Marcus, attempting to find something as a needle in a haystack. You can see that some of the metrics, 160 million to 200 million events per day. You know, in many cases, customers, even with a SOC, if it's a follow the sun SOC, trying to maintain and stay in front of 160 million events a day and understanding what's happening and finding that quote unquote needle in the haystack or that event that's going to cause or trigger an event that's going to give them an understanding of that a breach has occurred, it's next to impossible. The signal to noise ratio is continuously still a problem. And Edward Snowden, this was an insider, some malicious insider. Again, no amount of signatures, no amount of rules would have found this. This is someone who had access to through the sources and the servers and the tools that he was trying to compromise. No malware was involved, only credentials, mostly his own. He looked, acted, and felt like any other user in this system. How are customers going to find this type of activity by just doing traditional log analysis? So we always ask a question, is this your SOC? Alert fatigue, results are missed, signal to noise ratio is unmanageable, and a user's malicious activity is another user standard. But we always ask someone when we walk into a customer, you know, what is your SOC like? I mean, in many cases, it's the alert fatigue and trying to stay in front of all of the noise that's aggregating into that SIM solution or that log repository solution. But there is new hope. Hey! So again, I spent a lot of time in SIM. I spent probably too much time in SIM. I spent 10 years at a SIM vendor. But tracing a log through SIM looks very much like this. You take the alert and extract some features. You search for the host names and the users and IPs, and you're hoping you could do some of this through correlation. You extract all the logs, and then you read the logs. And this process typically takes quite a bit of time. And if you're breached, you bring in a Mandiant or you bring in a third-party company to do some type of security breach analysis. They're doing the same thing. What's the first thing that these guys will ask you if a customer is breached? What do they ask for? The logs. The first thing they ask for is, give me your logs, right? There you go. There are the logs. Good luck with that, right? It's a very small file. That's just the correlated events. That's not even the raw logs. Connection graphs. Again, in many cases, a lot of these solutions, the SIM solutions especially, are leveraging connection graphs. They're trying to stitch together user activities, and they're trying to stitch together all the entities that are tied to users. So integrating the state of changes, trying to incorporate, take in consideration time, and abstracting individual events. But again, in many cases, these are in dashboards that you have to drill into. And then again, there's a lot of click time in order to try to find something that's interesting, even within the SIMs. So user activity as a connected graph. We're going to start to talk about machine learning. The user who's logging in remotely, accessing systems, connecting to the SIM, or connecting to the network, accessing resources, looking at event sources on the network, and then what folder access, what file access do they have to those systems. So let's apply machine learning to a couple of use cases. So in this case, we have Barbara. Barbara connects remotely a lot. She's a sales rep for this organization. So we have Barbara making multiple connections to the network. When you're leveraging user behavior analysis and machine learning, you have the ability to apply models to this, where you can graphically depict what's happening with Barbara in this case. You can see in this case, Barbara connects typically from the United States for the majority of the time. She's been to Canada, she's been to Germany, she's been to China once or twice, but you can see that this is her, we're basically tracking user behavior. What is normal for a user like Barbara? So in order for you guys to figure out what anomalies are happening within a customer's environment, you first have to track what's normal. You have to track and establish a baseline for every user, because the only way you're going to know what is an anomaly against what a user is doing within the network is to know their baseline of activity. So it's important to get history about a user to do that type of analysis. You're going to let the data speak for itself. Barbara regularly connects to the United States. It's abnormal for Barbara to connect from China. And in this case, again, just graphically looking at the data, Barbara has never connected from Brazil. So let's apply machine learning to this use case. So you have your user. Who is the user in the organization? What are the user's peers? So when you're applying machine learning and behavior analysis, it's important to not only establish a baseline for normal for the user, but you also want to establish that same baseline for their peer group, and also then establish that baseline for the organization. So it's important to bring in that historical information, not just about the users, but her peers. If Barbara's in HR, what are the systems that Barbara typically connects to? What does Barbara's peers typically connect to? So if Barbara logs in from China and all of a sudden is connecting to all these different hosts, as of today, that's easy for us to see as an anomaly. Because historically speaking, when Barbara logs in, she's connecting to these hosts. So you can track all of that normal behavior. So it's important to establish that baseline of norm so that you can understand what the anomalies are. Does that make sense? So does this user have any special characteristics? Is she an executive? Is she a privileged user? What's cool about machine learning is that, again, it's not just about the user and the peers, but we can also take in consideration when you're modeling user behavior, what is their role in the organization? Does their asset have critical IP? Does she have access to assets that have critical IP? Because again, all of those things you want to take into consideration when you're leveraging machine learning to model user behavior. When does she normally log in? When was the last time she was seen as a user? Did she walk in at 4 o'clock in the morning and log on to the system? She typically logs in at 9 a.m., but on this day, she came in at 4 a.m. Again, is that malicious? Maybe not, but it's still something that's considered an anomaly. It's an important fact that someone needs to know about from a SOC perspective. If this is something that's outside of the norm, you could still, it doesn't mean you have to set the alarms, but you could still track that type of activity. And it's bubbled up very easily by applying machine learning. So where's the user connecting from? The ISP. What state? What country? Where does the user usually log in from? Is the user's source IP known as a good or bad IP? I mean, you can take those things into consideration. You can bring in context about users. In many cases, when you're doing machine learning with UVA Solutions, you are going back to the customer's whatever directory that they use to track users, whether it's Active Directory, whether it's an IDM solution. You want to bring in all of that rich information about all the users, all those groups, and their roles in the organization so that we can have a good understanding of applying machine learning. And then you can bring in VPN logs, because in many cases, a lot of organizations have users that are coming in through VPN doing remote access and accessing critical IP. So you can bring in those logs and apply some of that logic to machine learning as well. But again, you're taking information from their directories to get an understanding of what are their roles, what's their, what are their peer groups, what do they typically access on a daily basis, whether it's a file share, whether it's a physical server. All of that stuff can be stitched together and tied to one user. So who's used this asset before? What kind of user login is happening to this asset? What actions are normally performed on those assets? All of that information, and guess what, guys? This is all information that the customer's already collecting in their log repository or their SIM. UBA Solutions are just taking advantage of the resources that customers have already made a massive, massive investment in already. And they're gleaning that information from those logs. Which user uses this network? What peer groups are using the network? So, when you're doing machine learning and behavioral analysis, you don't necessarily want to raise alerts for every time someone logs into a machine that they've never logged into before. Because again, you don't want to create too many false alerts. For the analysts, they're already doing that type of stuff today. You want to take in consideration, hey, yes, this was the first time. Yes, that was an anomaly, so I'll track that. But has anyone else in her peer group touched that box? Maybe there's a new initiative. Maybe there's a new project that they've been assigned to, right? So there could be an answer to that. But again, the idea behind UBA is visibility. We want to give you an understanding of what's normal for these users, and then trigger and show you when those anomalies occur. And again, those anomalies may not necessarily be malicious. It's just different from their baseline. Establishing baselines is no different than establishing baselines from a networking perspective. You're just applying those same concepts to the users in the environment. Make sense? So which users normally use this server? Which users are the administrators of these servers? What applications run on these servers? How does these users normally access this server? UBA Solutions have the ability to not only know whether or not have you ever accessed that box, what credentials were used. Maybe you log in with Huff in the morning, and then I switch credentials. Maybe I SSH'd over to a box, and now I'm using a whole different set of credentials to access another box that I've never hit before. If I'm a SOC analyst, I want to know about that. And being able to present that type of activity in one view for a user is pretty cool. Without having to write correlation rules, without having to mine through logs, having that all presented in one view is what UBA does. Is this alert a common alert in the organization? Has this alert ever fired before? Again, all these things are taken in consideration. Which user accesses the applications? Applications are interesting because it's not just about the systems that they're connecting to, but what about the applications that happen to be running on those systems? It could be an application that runs resident on that box. It could be a cloud-based application. What if I'm getting rid of a sales rep who's just not performing at all? What do sales reps typically do to the CRMs right before they're about to walk out the door? Yeah, they dump their contact lists. Wouldn't you want to know about that? You can do those types of things by taking into consideration the applications that these users are connecting to. Who access the files normally? Where is these files and where are they accessed? One of the things about a UBA solution is that you're taking, again, I keep coming back to, UBA solutions are taking advantage of the fact that the customer's already collecting all these logs. And in many cases, you can answer a lot of these questions through endpoint solutions, right? I mean, a lot of times, if I'm plugging in a USB stick into a server, and that happens to be a critical server, I would hope someone had some type of a host-based solution on that box that was tracking that type of activity, or the level of auditing was turned on enough for me to know that that happened. But wouldn't it be cool to know that user ABC logged in today, normal time, they did this activity, I have a security alert that hit on her box, and all of a sudden now she's connecting to all these other systems that she's never connected to before. And oh, by the way, there was an endpoint alert that says that, hey, a USB stick was plugged into a system, and now I have another alert that says something is exiting the network. You could stitch all of that together by taking advantage of the logs that the customer's already collecting. Instead of just using correlation rules to try to stay in front of this, you're applying machine learning to do it. Make sense? Yeah. So let's look at that alert again that we talked about, the stitching and the connection. So this is what user behavior analytics does. User Barbara has abnormally logged in using the VPN from China, is accessing networks she's never accessed before. No one in her peer group uses this server, normally only reads this file and never edits. An alert is fired for the malware, and the first time this malware is seen in this organization ever. Try to build a rule to do that. And you may be successful, right? But for the first time, what about the next time? Trying to maintain and track user behavior is very hard to do, especially through static rules. Trying to predict every possible behavior without understanding what's the baseline of norm for your users is next to impossible. I did it. I tried to do it for 10 years when I was in the sim space. It's very hard to do. But when you're applying user behavior analytics and doing machine learning, you're letting those solutions or that type of technology or methodology do all the heavy lifting for you. Customer doesn't have to build any rules. The models take in consideration all this user behavior. It captures all of that, establishes a baseline. And then it just basically looks at all the normal traffic thereafter and looking at anything that's different than what we've previously seen. That's what user behavior analytics does. Make sense? I think that's my last slide. I think I left some time for questions, so any questions, please?
Yeah, so you turn this on,
Do you have the microphone? 1 second.
Okay, so this tool will build that baseline, kind of build that topology on user behavior.
Right.
And then what you turn it on, and I mean, from the standpoint that it's going to start reporting on everything, it looks like it's abnormal. Is there a lot of tuning that has to be done to kind of figure out?
That's a good question. Yeah, so what's cool about a lot of the UBA solutions, I can't account for every one of them, but a good UBA solution, when they're developing rules, will only fire off based on a certain risk threshold being met. Because, good Lord, if I did everything that was maybe outside of the norm, what's cool about if you have a good UBA solution is going to assign risk points to users as you're going through the day. And a user might get, I'm just going to throw out numbers, maybe a user gets 50 points a day, and my threshold is 90. I'm building up points, but I never get to 90, which means I'm not that big red X in the console saying, look at me now, right? So yes, you can certainly tune the models, you can certainly tune the rules, but a good UBA solution will have out-of-the-box thresholds. If the user does not necessarily meet those thresholds, then you're not going to have to sound the alarm for every abnormal activity. But the cool thing is, as an analyst, I can go back when that alarm does go off, I can go back to see what may have led up to it. Maybe they had a couple of 50s, 60s, 70s, that low and slow kind of stuff. I didn't necessarily chase yet, but the UBA tracked it. And then they hit that 90. Now I can go back historically to see what may have led up to that, which could be a pretty interesting story.
The two biggest questions I have are one,
Oh, sorry. No, good. He's halfway between the two.
you don't have the mic, I thought I was loud. So the two questions I have that are of top of mind are, number one, I'm kind of worried about finding, what if there's already a malicious actor in there and I'm doing normal behavior of a malicious actor, and I just think it's normal and we let it go forever and ever. So how do you find that when you think it's normal when it's really malicious? And number two, the more information you collect on a user, the more I can see the EU getting all upset about all the privacy. How would you address that?
Yeah, good question. So I'll take the first one first, obviously. So that's a good one, because when I'm dropped into an environment for the first time, how do I know if someone's doing bad? That's their baseline. That's their baseline. So that's not, for me, that guy's a bad guy, but that's normal for him because he's just bad. That's a problem. That's why you want to have that extra set of metrics to compare him to. Is he bad in comparison to his peer group? Because if his peer group's bad, then holy cow, you've got a bigger problem, right? But that's why you take in, you're not only just comparing what he's doing, you're also comparing him to his peer group. That's why we want to bring in LDAP, so we know, is this person in HR, right? This person in HR she's been doing some pretty bad stuff. She's been logging onto the payroll system and printing stuff out because she wants to know if somebody else is getting paid higher than she is, right? She's been doing that for a while. That's normal. But I can then compare her against someone else in her peer group who's not doing that, right? So now I'm starting to see the variances of what she's doing necessarily, and then I'm then looking at what her peer group is, and then comparing that to the organization. That's why you have to have that multiple levels of comparison to get a good understanding of what norm is. That's a very good question. The second question is, in Germany and things like that, we've had to obfuscate user names. Instead of presenting their pretty picture or not so pretty picture and their roles in the organization, you may only see their SID. And then you have to, put some type of a ticket in place in order to understand who that person is on the back end. But we do have to obfuscate data within the user interface in those countries, especially the EU, with privacy laws. Absolutely.
Thank you.
No problem.
It sounds like the solution has a dependency and requirements to have an IDAM in place and role-based access in place. Otherwise, how can you correlate to the peers? How can you correlate to what you need to do? And it's similar to the DLP, that the system works great, it's a great idea, but putting the categories and slapping the proper tags on everything, that's the biggest challenge. I have yet to see a large organization have role-based implemented all across the board. So getting that data looks awesome. I would like to have that, but it looks like 10 years away at this point.
Yeah. So I'll answer the second piece first. Walking into customers' environments and their Active Directory infrastructure, it's rare when it's pristine. I mean, that is what it is. So it's the same thing in asking a customer, hey, where's your CMDB database? Yeah, about that. No, and I get that. But for UVA, any UVA solution to be of value to a customer, the things that they absolutely need and which would make a really big impact are VPN logs, Active Directory logs, the domain controller logs, and I would say some security alerts to stitch into that would probably be a good thing. But from our perspective, with the solution that we have, again, the things that we look for mainly are VPN logs, domain controller logs. Those are the things that are going to give us the most, and the ability to do an LDAP call to wherever those users are stored.
So you're looking for like 465s, log
Exactly.
events and stuff
Exactly.
like that.
This is the traditional event IDs that most these DCs are already writing to. And in many cases, we do have instances where customers will say, yeah, most of my domain controllers are in my SIM, but not all of them.
So
Or I'm in the middle of upgrading and, some are reporting in, some are not. And in some cases, most SIM solutions are just using traditional APIs to pull the information from these log repositories or SIMs, but you also can send these solutions syslog. So we have a customer that's using Snare, and because they didn't have all of their DCs going into their SIM, because they may be in the middle of a transition to go away from that SIM. So they're using snare or, or syslog ng or something like that. If there is a way for us to get to the original log source, then you can architect it to do so. I mean, the best cases is if they have a primary log repository or a SIM, but if they have the ability to get what we need from a syslog feed, then would be great. And we also, just to give you a heads up, customers are also doing things like using ELK. They have ELK stacks. So they're putting all their data in these data lakes, right? And we can pull information from there, because some people are saying, we are done with SIM. We're going to go to Hadoop. We're going to go to whatever solution that I've made investments in. And we just have a customer that just invested in an ELK stack, and we're pulling from there. So as long as we have the ability to get to the logs, whether it's an API call or them sending us those events through a syslog stream, then we can integrate.
Can you do that in reverse and create the role from the baseline? So can I take the baseline that you studied and analyze, and from that create the roles and make it as a baseline of roles that I can use?
No, I hear what you're saying. Well, I can tell you this. When customers have implemented the solution, they have gone back to their Windows admins to discuss what's going on in AD. So you can certainly glean something from what we're seeing, and to go back to the domain admins to say, hey, because in many cases, people don't know what they're missing in terms of event IDs, because there are specific event IDs that UBA Solutions really are looking for to know whether something is a remote logon versus an interactive logon, whether or not they're connecting to a physical box versus a file share. I mean, those are very specific event IDs. And in many cases, customers start to realize, holy cow, I don't have access to all those logs. And that in and of itself is a journey for them to struggle through, to go back internally to try to fix that.
So two-part question. So you talked about the stitching together of those individual elements or sensors.
Yes.
And then the sensing whether or not the activity is either dangerous or benign. My question is, what's the level of effort between the analyst, meaning human interaction, versus the technology that actually stitches those together correctly and
Good
then
question.
determines whether or not it's either benign or nefarious correctly?
Right.
What's the level of effort between human and technology?
Good question. A good UBA solution, a good UBA solution will do all the heavy lifting for you. For example, I'm taking all of that, the fact that Barbara logged in through the VPN to China, she connected to all these different servers, she hit this particular application, and now there was a USB stick that was plugged into a server, or maybe she logged onto this database, performed a SQL command, downloaded something, and now is sending something outbound. If I have all of that logged, you want a good UBA solution to display that all in one view. A good UBA solution will stitch that together, and oh, by the way, they'll put a timeline to it. When they logged in, when all of this happened, and we'll also stitch in those security alerts along the way. So instead of having to build rules to try to do that, I tried to do that. I tried to do that for 10 years, but it's all done on the back end. All the heavy lifting is done on the back end with a good UVA solution.
But after it bubbles up, because you got Barbara, Brenda, Bob.
That's the risk score. That's where the risk engine comes into play. Because you are assigning, so as you're seeing all these disparate anomalies that may be happening, you may get a 10 here, a 5 there, and again, that could be tweaked and tuned. But after accumulation of all of those 5s and 10s throughout a day, before she logs off, if she goes over 90, as I'm just going to throw out an arbitrary number, if she goes over 90, now all of a sudden that's going to show up as a notable user with a red indicator to the analyst that I need to drill into that. So I can say, hey, Barbara has a score of 90 or higher. I'm going to drill into Barbara, and it's going to present to me everything that Barbara did for the day, everything, meaning where she logged in from, what she's connected to, whether or not, you can bring in physical badge logs, right? You can pretty much parse anything. These UBA solutions are just using traditional parsers, normalizing the data, and presenting it within a user interface. So you can bring in physical access logs as well. So I can know that, hey, instead of a VPN connection, maybe Barbara came in to the office at 4 a.m. and she traditionally comes in at 9 a.m. I'm going to flag that as something that's an anomaly, and I may maybe only assign 10 points to that. But now I'm going to watch what she does moving forward. And what's cool about this, she may log off and never make it to 90, but I'm going to transfer some of that risk from the day before to the next day. And I'm continuously watching her. No, the risk, yeah, exactly. All of these things can be tunable within a customer's environment. Yeah, for sure.
What kind of overhead on the network does this have? Is this also an agent or agentless solution?
Agentless, yeah. We're just using traditional APIs that are already baked into all of these SIM solutions. Like, they all have them. Splunk, ArcSight, Q1.
So are you essentially parsing the syslog data to capture
Absolutely.
this?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're just, and if it's pulling it as a native API, it's pulling in the format that it's being stored on the SIM. Now, we can accept a traditional RFC syslog feed or a Ceph feed inbound to us as well. So it's either a push or a pull. Traditionally, we would like to do a pull because a pull gives us the ability to get history. I want to go back 90 days. I don't want to just say what I'm tracking this user as of today, because that takes a little bit of time to train the system, to establish a baseline and train the system so that we understand what's normal. If I have the ability to go back 90 days, now I have some history about a user. But you can either do a push or a pull. The push is syslog.
So as far as your architecture, can you install this on, say, virtual servers? And does it have like a back-end database, or what is the architecture?
It's using a
look
Mongo database.
Mongo?
A Mongo database.
Okay.
Yeah. And everything is encompassed on the box. We do have a virtual instance where we could tell customers you need a pretty beefy system in order to run a virtual machine. But we have an appliance platform, form factor, and everything is encompassed within that system.
Great.
So I have a couple questions, and you partially addressed one of them already in that you said it's able to pull in physical badges.
Yes.
Is the system intelligent enough to know that if a person is logged in on site, if they've badged in on site, that they probably shouldn't be VPNing from someplace else as well?
That was that traditional use case that SIMs were trying to do many, many, many moons ago. I mean, when I started, that was like 10 years ago. Yes.
Sure.
That would be flagged as an anomaly.
Now, the focus of your talk today is basically on insider threats
Yes.
and people, and that's great. What about, and I don't expect you to address this completely, but on a summary high-level basis, what does the system do for external threats?
Yeah, so with external threats, we have something called, it's basically what we call it hunting. And we are bringing in security alerts, whether it's from, I'll just throw a couple, FireEye, a semantic DLP, the old Vontu stuff, endpoint solutions, Carbon Black, whatever. So we can bring in those security alerts that are traditionally put in place for prevention, or if they're basically placed on the inside to look for APTs and malware. We can take the alerts that are triggered from those solutions and bring them into our product. And then we just stitch those alerts as part of the normal timeline for a user. So if Barbara, when she logged in through China, she was doing her normal stuff, and all of a sudden a FireEye alert hit on her box, we would stitch that in the time that it happened. And that would show up as her part of her normal timeline. But what's cool about it, I then get to continue to track what she's done after that malware alert.
So I was just going to ask, do y'all use the RESTful API when you're pulling in?
Yes.
And do you also support like the McAfee SIM solution as well?
We do support the Nitro solution, yes.
Okay.
We do. Oh, thank you. Okay, sounds good.
So you mentioned peer analysis, and for statistical analysis, you need a sufficient sample size.
Yes.
So I guess I'm getting to the sizing and pricing issue, and how it works from different enterprise organizations.
Yes.
On the too big side, if you've got too many applications and too many things going, it's too much and overwhelming.
Sure.
And on the too small size, we don't have enough peers to run samples, or it might not be cost effective for somebody small. Is there an appropriate sizing that this works with in an enterprise? Small, medium, large?
Yeah.
Ken is our guy for pricing.
So to answer your question, the way that we, and it's different for every UBA vendor, but speaking specifically to Exabeam, the way that we price is per employee. So if you have an organization that has, our largest customer is about 260,000 employees, and so that's their licensing model is based upon the number of employees, not the number of credentials, because most employees, a lot of employees have multiple or several credentials that they can use. We're going to track all of that, but we're only licensing for that employee or contractor that organization has within the organization.
Where at the low end, where is it not economical for a small company?
I mean, I think that every case is different, right? It's the challenges that companies are using UBA for is going to define what their threshold is as to how much of an investment it would make sense and justify. But I think our smallest account is probably a company of about 350 employees. But for the most part, we're typically seeing our sweet spot in the year and a half that we've been out has been from 20 to 70,000 employees is around the area that we're seeing.
Anybody else?
Lisa, excellent job. Really do appreciate that. But somebody who used to brief at Cyber Command, flag officers for current operations, who ran the Army's network worldwide.
Yes, sir.
I grew up here as an industrial engineer, so I get security. I understand this audience in terms of compliance, and I definitely believe your tool works well there. But as you're gathering up information of an individual, and I respect what you did for the Germans, they talk a lot about privacy. But it really does depend. It depends on what agency you talk to.
I agree. That's true.
I talked to a lot of lawyers out of Washington, and you'd be amazed on the other stories. But your approach was right. How do you take this back to why are we doing all this? I mean, we're not buying IT so what? We can employ security companies. So,
right.
We're doing it for a business purpose. I mean, as fast as the attacks are happening,
right.
And as voluminous as they are, the real race is to the marketplace. Yeah, if you're not there first, and you don't have the product, and you don't take your distributed, business practice, and you don't change that carrier and get it there, all those resources get there first and fastest and the best.
Right.
So I really want to have, this may not be the time and place, but I'm interested in approaches that, in terms, what's the process? What are we trying to go do? How do I bring hardworking people, meaning well, to bring their best game in everything they're doing, because you really only get one shot at the market.
No, I'm with you. I think, and it is something, it's a bigger discussion that we can certainly have offline, but for me, dealing with so many different tools in the past, and I've been on both sides. I've been in the trenches and I've been on the vendor side. And for me, the key to be successful is visibility. And when you're that eyes on glass person, or that person that's brought in after the breach, where you have that spotlight on you, visibility is what's important. And at the end of the day, when all these breaches, if you look at all of them, what are they after? User credentials. And until someone solves the problem and make it 80-factor authentication, I'm just kidding. It's user credentials. I mean, if you read the Verizon 2015 report, they said that the user credentials are the digital keys to the kingdom, and it's still apropos. I mean, it's valid. I mean, the bad guys are making their way in, and they're using very unique ways of doing it, and then they're staying in front of us. And at the end of the day, though, they're trying to get access to credentials. And a UBA solution is trying to give visibility into, not necessarily to dive into what was the malware that caused the exposure to that particular asset. It's more along the lines of, okay, give me the story that led up to this, so that I can try to better my policies and procedures to try to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
That's why I think we're communicating. You're talking about the process.
Yeah.
Not giving all the details of how it happened.
Yes.
And that's why you're right. I'm trying to over horizon where I would like to see solutions. And there's a Dr. Parker panel who talks about the generations of security.
Yeah.
They're on the 4th generation. I believe what you're saying, if we're communicating correctly, is 5th generation, because why are we doing this? It's
Yeah.
about the business.
No, I could not agree with you more. And the business's exposure are the people that have access to their systems. Yeah.
There's a Steve Kavinsky, who was the deputy for FBI cybersecurity. And he says, so, all right, how many Fortune 500s are there, right?
Right.
But how many small businesses are there? 26 million.
Yeah, that's true.
That's the marketplace.
No.
And they're
I'm with you.
I mean, I'm not the big boys.
Yeah.
You are the target.
Yeah, if you read over the Visa investigation and the Verizon investigation of Target, I mean that Fazio, I think that's what it was called, Fazio, the HVAC system, the HVAC organization,
Right.
they didn't necessarily have access to Active Directory, but they had enough access in their Reba system, and that was the point of entry.
Right.
And then the bad guys took it from there.
Sure.
And they were able to hop and get to what they needed to get to, unfortunately. But no, your point is valid. I agree. I mean, it's not just a security issue; it's a business process issue as well, for sure. No worries. Any other questions? Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time.